watching humans enter battle, explained their galactic reputation. The last thing the Vreth High Council expected was silence. When the Coalition sent word that human reinforcements were coming, every species on the warship Dusk Carrier had opinions. The Sulari engineers said it was a political gesture. The Doran pilots said it was an insult dressed as help. Even the cleaning drone seemed to hum with doubt. But when the human transport finally docked at Bay 4 and the airlock hissed open, what came out of it was not noise or bravado or the dramatic entrance of warriors arriving to save the day. 300 humans walked out in single file, quiet, calm, carrying their gear like it weighed nothing because they had carried it so long they had stopped noticing. Susk watched from the upper rail of the bay. He was the highest-ranking Vreth officer aboard, 6 campaigns behind him, the kind of soldier who had stopped being surprised by most things years ago. He watched the humans fan out across the bay floor and he said nothing. Beside him, a younger officer named Ash leaned forward and squinted. "They look soft," Ash said. "Most things that will kill you do," Susk said. He had pulled the old intelligence file before the transport docked. It was thin, mostly fragmented field reports, nothing confirmed, the kind of data that collected around species who moved through conflict zones and left strange patterns behind. There was one piece that stayed with him. A Krath battlefield dispatch, intercepted 2 years ago, marked as low priority and never followed up on. It read, "Do not engage the soft ones unless ordered. They do not behave as prey should." The Krath did not write things like that about anyone. Susk folded the note back into his memory and watched the humans organize themselves below with minimal talk and maximum efficiency. Their field commander came last off the transport. Her name was Rael. She was shorter than Susk expected, with a worn jacket and the kind of stillness around her eyes that came from making hard decisions too many times. She looked at the bay for 3 seconds, cataloged everything in it, and walked straight to the nearest wall display to pull up the colony terrain map. No introduction, no waiting for permission. Breck, the Sulari liaison assigned to bridge communication between species, scurried over to her with a prepared greeting. She listened to it for 4 seconds and then asked him where the Northern Ridge Access Road connected to the colony's eastern supply line. Breck looked at Susk. Susk said nothing. Breck answered the question. What followed for the next 2 hours was not what Ash or anyone else on the ship had expected. The humans did not boast. They did not perform confidence for an audience. They moved through the warship in small groups, checking equipment, asking short questions about atmospheric conditions on the colony surface, testing their suits, eating their rations without complaint. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered soldier named Davo, sat on a crate in the corner of the bay and sharpened a blade with slow, patient strokes while humming something quietly to himself. A Doran pilot named Vis stood near enough to hear the humming and eventually asked what it was. Davo said it was a song his grandmother used to sing. He said it had no title. He kept sharpening. Vis went back to the others and said she could not get a read on them and was not sure whether that was good or bad. Susk spent the early evening reviewing the colony situation. The Krath armored column had been dug into the northern ridge for 11 days. Coalition forces had tried 3 separate push attempts and failed each time. The colony's southern sectors were already lost. The eastern water processing station had been dark for 6 days. By any honest calculation, the colony had perhaps 4 days before the population loss became irreversible. 300 humans were not, by any rational math, enough. He went back to the bay before lights down to check the readiness reports Breck had started compiling. Rael was there, still at the terrain display, cross-referencing approach angles with elevation data. She had a photograph tucked under the band on her wrist, small and worn at the edges, the image too faint to read from a distance. She had not removed it since she boarded. Susk stopped beside her and looked at the display. The Northern Ridge approach has a 91% casualty projection under current Krath positioning, he said. I know, she said. Our last 3 engagements. I read them, she said. She pointed to a narrow corridor of high ground on the eastern flank of the ridge. This is where we go in. Susk looked at the corridor. It was narrow, exposed for 400 meters, and directly in line with 2 craft-heavy emplacements. He waited a moment before speaking. That is arguably the worst approach on this map. It's the only one they won't have modeled, she said, because no one rational would use it. She turned off the display, picked up her pack, and walked back toward the billet area with the same unhurried pace she did everything else. Susk stood alone in the bay. He pulled up the craft dispatch one more time on his personal unit. He read it again. He thought about what it must have taken to make the craft afraid to write a full sentence. Then he went to file the combat authorization for Rail's approach. He did not sleep well that night. He was not sure if that was worry or something closer to expectation. Watching humans enter battle explained their galactic reputation. Breck had written 17 xenocultural field reports in his career. He had documented the pre-battle rituals of the Doran, the silence protocols of the Vreth, the collective humming ceremonies the Sulari used to synchronize their nervous systems before high-stress events. He believed, with the confidence of a trained observer, that he understood how sentient species behaved when they were preparing to face death. He did not understand humans at all. He followed them through the ship for the full day before the assault, tablet in hand, and what he recorded did not fit any existing behavioral model he had studied. They were not solemn. They were not focused in the way trained warriors were focused. They laughed, constantly, casually, about everything, including the things that should not have been funny. Davo gathered his squad in the corridor outside the equipment room for a final gear check. While he was going through the list, a soldier named Pris held up her boot and announced that the sole was cracking, and she was going to fight the entire Krath armored column with one bare foot. Davo told her that was fine because she couldn't hit anything at range anyway, and the Krath would be close enough to kick by the time she was useful. The squad laughed. Pris threw the boot at Davo. He caught it, handed it back, and kept reading the gear list. Breck noted humor deployed under stress. Function unclear. Investigate further. He investigated further. He noticed that every joke landed softer than it started, that after each round of laughter the squad settled into their work with something steadier in their movements, less scattered, more present. It took him an embarrassingly long time to understand what he was watching. They were not laughing because they were unafraid. They were laughing because they were afraid, and the laughter burned off just enough of it to let them keep moving. He wrote fear management through collective humor, remarkably efficient, still strange. The second thing that threw him was the food. He had been assigned to make sure the humans had access to adequate nutrition during their time aboard. He ran a standard scan of their ration packs as part of the process, and the scanner flagged the spice additive they mixed into nearly everything as a Class II chemical irritant. He checked the scan twice. Then he found Davo in the mess corridor and showed him the reading. Davo looked at the scanner, then at Breck, then back at the scanner. He grinned in the particular wide way Breck had already started to associate with humans who found something delightful. He pulled a small container from his kit and held it out. "Hot sauce," he said. "You want some?" Breck said he did not want some. Davo shrugged and added a generous amount to his ration pack. He ate it with visible satisfaction. Breck noted voluntarily consumes chemical irritants for pleasure. No framework available for this. Moving on. But the thing that stayed with him was Pris. After the gear check, after the jokes, after the hot sauce incident, he watched her set up a practice target at the far end of the loading bay. He had heard Davo call her the worst shot in the regiment. He had heard her laugh about it. He watched her raise her weapon without ceremony, without adjusting her stance, almost without looking, and put a round through the target's center point at 400 meters. He stood very still for a moment. Then he walked over and checked the distance marker on the floor. It said 412 meters. He wrote, "Do not confuse casualness for incompetence. Revisit all prior assessments." The afternoon brought something he had not scheduled. Rail gathered her squad leaders in the small briefing room off the main corridor. Breck was technically permitted to observe liaison meetings, so he stood near the back wall and watched. Rail did not give a speech. She put the terrain map up, pointed to the positions they would take, spoke for 11 minutes, and asked if anyone had questions. 2 people asked questions. She answered them directly. Then she said, "We know what this costs. Make sure it counts." That was the end of the briefing. Afterward in the corridor, Breck fell into step beside her. He asked her, because he genuinely did not know, "How do you prepare soldiers for a 91% casualty projection?" She looked at him, not unkindly. "You don't," she said. "You trust that they already know why they're here, and you make sure the plan is the best it can be." "And if the plan fails?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then we adjust." He wanted to ask more. She had already turned toward the billet area. He stood in the corridor with his tablet open and a long list of observations that were starting to feel like they added up to something he had no category for. He scrolled back to the beginning. He read the first line he had written, "Humor deployed under stress. Function unclear." He deleted the last 2 words and typed, "Function is survival." Then he went a fine Susk, because he had started to think that whatever was going to happen on that ridge tomorrow was not going to look like anything in the Coalition Tactical Library, and someone senior needed to know that before the assault began. Susk listened to everything Breck said. He was quiet for a long time after. Then he said, "I know." He said it like someone who had already made peace with not fully understanding something and had decided to trust it anyway. That was, Breck thought, either very wise or very reckless, possibly both. Watching humans enter battle explained their galactic reputation. The ship ran a night cycle even in deep orbit, dimming its lights to a low amber and dropping the ambient sound of its systems to a quieter register. Most of the crew slept. Breck did not sleep. He sat at his small desk in the liaison quarter for an hour trying to finish a report and eventually admitted to himself that the report was not going to get finished tonight and put the tablet down. He walked without a destination. Sulari did not wander, but tonight his legs took him through the amber corridors past the equipment bay, past the observation deck where the colony burned in small patches of orange below, and eventually to the corridor outside the human billet area. He heard them before he reached the door. Not noise, not the kind of group sound he had expected, talking, tension, the restless movement of people who could not settle. What he heard was quieter than that, scattered and careful, like rain on a small roof. He stopped in the doorway. Davo was on the floor against the far wall, knees up, the worn metal coin moving slowly over and under his fingers. He was not looking at anything in the room. His eyes were somewhere else entirely, somewhere the ship and the colony and the assault plan could not reach. He turned the coin. He breathed. He did not look up. Near the left bunk row, a soldier named Ferris was writing on actual paper with an actual pen, bent over his work with the concentration of someone who had a limited amount of paper and needed every word to count. Next to him, another soldier spoke quietly into a small recording device, her voice low enough that Breck could not make out the words, only the shape of them, the rising tone of describing something, the soft drop of an ordinary name. Pris was sketching. She had her back against the wall and her knees up and a scrap of paper balanced on them, and she drew with short focused strokes. Breck could not see the image clearly. He could see her face, and her face was very still, not sad, just present, in the way people were present when they were looking at someone they loved. Breck stood in the doorway and understood that he was watching something private. Not secret. Nothing was hidden here, nothing was being concealed. They were not performing grief, and they were not performing courage. They simply knew what tomorrow held, and they had decided not to pretend otherwise, and in the time remaining they were turning toward the people and places that made tomorrow worth walking into. He had studied pre-battle rituals for his entire career. He had never seen one that looked like this. He wrote in his tablet slowly, "They do not prepare by becoming harder. They prepare by remembering what they are soft for." He closed the tablet. "Can't sleep either." Rael had appeared beside him in the corridor without him noticing, which startled him more than he would admit. She was carrying 2 cups of something dark and steaming, and she held one out without making it a question. He took it. It was bitter and very hot and smelled like burned earth. He did not know what it was. He drank it anyway. They sat against the corridor wall, side by side, not quite in the doorway and not quite away from it. Through the gap Breck could still see Davo and his coin. The low amber light caught the metal each time it turned. Rael talked. Not about the assault, not about the ridge, not about projections or angles. She talked about a city on the western coast of her home continent where it rained 200 days a year, and the fish markets opened before the sun came up, and everything smelled like salt. She talked about a wall near her apartment where someone had painted a mural of birds. She had walked past it so many times she stopped seeing it, and then one morning she did see it and stood in the rain looking at it until she understood it was beautiful. She talked about her daughter, 8 years old, currently angry, deeply, genuinely angry that her mother had gone again. She had made this clear through a letter, a drawing, and a pointed silence during their last call that communicated more than most words Rael had heard in her life. Breck asked quietly if thinking about her daughter made tomorrow harder. Rael was quiet for a moment. She looked at the cup in her hands. "It makes it clearer," she said. He turned that over. He was not sure he understood it fully, and he did not ask her to explain it because he thought the explaining might ruin something. They sat in the amber quiet. Davo's coin caught the light. Pris's pencil moved in small strokes. Someone in the billet room laughed very softly at something in a recording. The colony burned in 4 small patches below. Breck sat with his bitter drink and felt something he did not have a word for in his own language. It was just the feeling of sitting beside someone who was afraid and was going anyway, and of being trusted with that, even for an hour, even in a corridor. He did not write any of it down. He had decided that before he had finished his first sip. Some things were not data. They sat until the cups were empty. Then Rael stood, said goodnight the way people said things that were also instructions, and went back to her people. Breck sat a little longer. Then he went back to his quarter and slept better than he had any right to. Watching humans enter battle explained their galactic reputation. The colony world did not have a name. The coalition had assigned it a catalog number, and the locals called it something in a dialect 3 translation layers removed from anything Breck could speak. From orbit it looked like a bruised, dark land, dark water. The craft positions on the northern ridge lit in hard white lines on the sensor display. Breck had been watching the display for 40 minutes by the time the assault began, and he had still not found a way to sit comfortably. Susk stood behind him. He had been standing the entire time. He had not said a word since Rael's regiment left the ship. The assault began 2 hours before the sun rose on the colony's eastern face. No signal sent. No timestamp announced over comms. The sensor display simply showed 300 human thermal signatures moving up the eastern flank of the ridge in a pattern that looked, to Breck's eye, less like a military formation and more like water finding a path downhill. They moved along contours, using the shape of the ground itself as cover, quiet enough that the craft sensor net did not register them until they were already 400 meters into the approach. Then the craft guns opened up and the display lit white. The noise came through the audio relay half a second later. Breck had heard weapons fire on recordings. He had reviewed engagement footage from 9 different conflict zones as part of his analyst training. He understood, intellectually, what sustained craft suppression fire sounded like. He had not understood, until this moment, that understanding something and hearing it were entirely different experiences. He put one hand flat on the console without realizing he had done it. Two thermal signatures on the display went still. Breck's chest went cold. The other 298 kept moving. He had expected in the deepest honest part of himself that he had not been willing to fully examine, a hesitation. A pause while the regiment absorbed the shock of first contact, reorganized, found a new rhythm. Every species he had ever studied showed that pause. It was not weakness. It was biology. The humans did not pause. They changed. It was visible even on the thermal display. Something in the pattern of their movement compressed and sharpened. They got lower, faster, and quieter, which seemed physically impossible given that they were moving uphill under direct fire. They spread their angles without being told. They stopped being a group moving together and became something harder to describe, a system, each part aware of the others, filling gaps before the gaps fully opened. Davo appeared on Breck's targeted display feed, because Breck had flagged him as a primary observation subject at the start of the engagement. He watched Davo cross a 40-meter stretch of open ground that the craft had ranged and pre-calculated. He watched the shots land around him. He watched Davo reach the other side. He ran the probability calculation manually because the sensor's automatic model had returned an error. The manual calculation confirmed what the sensor could not process. Davo reached a wounded soldier, got them up, moved them behind a ridge outcrop, and turned back toward the open ground. Breck said out loud without meaning to, "He's going back." "Yes," said Susk behind him. At the far left edge of the display, Pris had taken a position behind a broken craft communication relay and was holding it, not advancing, not falling back. A single soldier holding a piece of ground while two craft emplacements focused entirely on her position, and she was making them work for every inch of it. Her thermal signature was steady. 7 minutes she held. 8. Her squad came around the far side of the emplacement at 9 minutes, and the left flank of the craft line collapsed inward. Susk moved to stand beside Breck at the display. The second emplacement is now exposed. Rael had already seen it. Her signature was moving before Susk finished the sentence. The second hour was worse in the way the second hour of any sustained engagement was worse. Momentum existed, but it had a cost, and that cost showed in still signatures accumulating on the display with quiet regularity. Breck stopped counting at 11. Rael took a hit in the 104th minute. Her signature dropped, stabilized, stayed still for 40 seconds, then resumed movement. He pulled her biomonitor feed. Left arm. Field dressing applied. She had issued 3 movement orders during those 40 seconds. She had not stopped once. Susk read the same feed over Breck's shoulder and said nothing. At the third hour, the craft column's rear communication node went dark. Then the rear resupply line. Then the eastern emplacement stopped firing, not because it had been destroyed, but because it had lost coordination with the rest of the column. Individual decisions in an army built on synchronized command was the same as the beginning of collapse. The craft northern ridge line broke from the inside. Breck watched it on the display, the white lines of the craft positions going from rigid and orderly to scattered, and then to nothing. He watched the colony's eastern sector drop from high thermal to low in 40 minutes as the fires there went out one by one. He sat very still in the quiet of the sensor room. Behind him, Susk finally sat down. Watching humans enter battle explained their galactic reputation. They came back in the same quiet they had left with, and somehow that was the hardest thing to watch. Breck had expected something, not celebration exactly, but release. Some exhale that matched the scale of what had just happened. The craft column was broken. The colony was secured. The math that was supposed to be ugly had been paid in full by people who knew the price when they agreed to it. The humans set down their weapons and their gear, and then went back and picked up their dead. And they did not set those down. They came through the transport bay in groups of 6 and 8, quiet and efficient, carrying stretchers with the care of people who had decided that care was the last useful thing they could offer. The wounded were brought in first, then the dead, then the rest, who moved with the slowness of people whose legs still worked but who were not in a hurry to prove it. Breck stood near the bay entrance and watched. He did not have a function here. He was just standing, holding his tablet without having opened it once. Davo came through with a stretcher. He set it down at the bay medical station, stood up straight, and noticed Breck the way people notice things that had been in their peripheral vision for a while and had finally resolved into focus. He walked over. Breck prepared a professional observation. He had several drafted in his head, questions about squad cohesion, about mid-engagement decision structures, about how humans maintain tactical communication under sustained fire. He opened his mouth. Davo said, "You all right?" Breck closed his mouth. "I mean you personally," Davo said. "You've been standing in the same spot for a while." Breck said he was fine. He said, "I was watching all of it from up here and I have been trying to find adequate words for what I watched, and I do not have any." Davo looked at him for a moment, not with the evaluating look Breck had cataloged from other human-to-alien interactions, the one that measured distance and translated across unfamiliarity, just a straight look between one person and another. "We're not brave because we're not scared," he said. "We're brave because we are scared and we go anyway. There's a difference." He went back to the stretcher and moved it to the next station. Breck stood there and did not write anything down. He thought about writing it down. He thought about it for several seconds and then decided that some things lost something in the recording of them, and this was one of those things. The debrief happened at evening. Susk convened it in the main briefing room with the full alien crew and Rail and her 4 surviving squad leaders. Breck sat in the back. The mission data went up on the display, and everyone looked at it in silence that ran slightly longer than silence usually ran. The numbers were extraordinary by any framework. They were also, if you knew what you were looking at on the casualty side, not numbers to feel good about. Young Ash, who sat 2 seats down from Breck, leaned toward Susk at the end and asked in a low voice, "How do you stand beside something like that and not feel like you are standing next to something dangerous?" Susk considered it. "Because they are dangerous for you, not at you," he said. "There is a difference, the Krath know that now." Ash thought about this for a while and did not ask another question. Rail submitted her after-action report that night. Breck read it because Susk forwarded it to the liaison team without comment. It was 11 pages. It named every soldier in the opening paragraph. It contained precise tactical analysis, specific equipment failure notes, and a detailed appendix recommending improvements to the human regiment's issued armor with measurements and suggested material substitutions. The last line of the report read, "Request resupply authorization and 12 hours rest before reassignment." It did not mention the ridge. It did not mention the broken column. It did not mention the dead, who had already been mentioned by name at the beginning. Breck read it twice. Susk read it and then opened a personal message interface that, according to ship records, he had last used 4 years ago for a birth announcement in his extended family. He wrote 8 words. "Request permanent human advisory attachment to this fleet. Indispensable." He added, "Full report follows," which was technically accurate because he had not yet written the full report and now had to. He sent the message to Coalition Command, and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. In the bay below, the humans were cleaning their gear with the same careful attention they gave everything. Davo was humming again. The coin was in his jacket pocket, Breck assumed, because it was not in his hand. Pris was checking her weapon components with a methodical focus that would not have been out of place in a postdoctoral research setting. The colony was quiet. The eastern sector's lights were coming back on, district by district, as the power grid reconnected now that the Krath had stopped feeding the disruption. From the viewport, it looked like someone was slowly turning on stars. Breck watched the lights come on and thought about a coin, and a photograph and a corridor, and the smell of burned earth in a cup. He thought, I came here to study them. He thought, I do not think I was the one doing the studying. Watching humans enter battle explained their galactic reputation. 6 months later, in a quieter part of the galaxy where no one was currently shooting at anything, Breck sat in his analyst workspace and looked at a blank document and thought about how to begin. He had been promoted. The title was Senior Xenocultural Combat Analyst, and it came with a better workspace and worse sleep, and the specific professional weight of being the person the Coalition now consulted when it needed to understand why humans did the things humans did. His report on the Northern Ridge engagement had circulated to 14 fleet commands. 3 of them had sent personal requests for follow-up briefings. The Vreth High Council had asked for a full behavioral assessment. The Doran Naval Division had asked for a shorter version because, as they put it, they were pilots and they needed the summary. He had all of it, every piece of data from the engagement, organized and cross-referenced. Rail's after-action report, Susk's forwarded notes, his own field recordings from the ship, the biomonitor feeds, the thermal display footage, the transcript of every conversation he had logged during the regiment's time aboard. He had enough to write a complete and technically accurate profile of human combat behavior that would satisfy every requesting party and advance his career considerably. He had been looking at the blank document for 20 minutes. He started writing, not the report, something else in the same window, because he had learned enough about himself in the past 6 months to know that sometimes you had to write the thing underneath before you could write the thing on top. He wrote about the photograph under Rail's wristband, which he had never been close enough to see clearly and had never asked about, and which she had carried through a 90-minute uphill assault under sustained craft fire and had presumably carried back out again. He wrote about what it meant to carry a photograph into a battle, not as a tactical observation, but as a simple fact about what it was to be human, which was to go to terrible places and bring the people you loved with you because leaving them behind was not something the species had ever fully learned to do. He wrote about Davo's coin. He described it precisely, the worn metal, the slow movement of it over and under his fingers in the dark before the assault, the particular stillness of his face while he turned it. He noted that he had never found out whose coin it was or where it came from or what it represented, and that he had decided, at some point between the ridge and this desk, that not knowing was acceptable. Some things were not for analysts. He wrote about Pris shooting a target at 400 meters while she was still laughing. He wrote about a corridor and a cup of something bitter and a woman who talked about fish markets and rain, and a daughter who was angry in the specific eloquent way of 8-year-olds, who understood exactly how much their anger communicated. He wrote, she said thinking about her made it clearer. I have been thinking about that sentence for 6 months. I believe she meant that the people waiting at home did not make it harder to walk into danger. They made it impossible to walk away from it. That is not a thing that translates easily into other languages. I am not sure it needs to. Then he wrote the part he had been building toward since the first morning after the ridge, when he had sat in his quarter with his tablet open and the cursor blinking and nothing coming out. Wrote, humans do not fight because they are built for it, though they are. They do not fight because they feel no fear, though they manage fear in ways no other species has replicated. They fight because they have each looked at what they love and made a private decision that it is worth more than their survival. They make that decision alone, in corridors at night with worn coins and small photographs, and then in the morning they walk toward the guns anyway. We have spent a long time studying how humans became so dangerous. I believe we were asking the wrong question. The question was never the danger. The question was always what they are protecting. The answer every time is each other. He submitted the report. Both versions, the formal behavioral assessment, which was thorough and well-sourced and 12 pages long, and the other one, which he labeled simply as a field observer note and attached as a supplemental document because he was not quite sure what category it belonged in. 3 weeks later, 16 fleet commands had submitted formal requests for permanent human advisory attachments. A Vreth logistics clerk processing the forms, apparently having read the supplemental note, added a new optional field to the standard request form. The field said, "Reason for request." It was not required. Every fleet filled it in. Breck received forwarded copies because he was now the person the Coalition sent things like this to, and he read through them one evening in his workspace with the lights low. Every fleet had written something different, and every fleet had ended the same way, with his last line copied out in their own filing systems in 14 different script formats and 3 different translation conventions, but the same words. The answer every time is each other. He sat with that for a while. Then he opened a new document because there were 12 more requests waiting and he had work to do. But first he sat with it for a while,